Welcome back, listeners and even viewers on the Arcade Attack podcast. I've got another super guest on today's show, a true gaming legend, American McGee. America, thank you so much for your time today. You know, you've seen it all, you've done it all. Part of id Software, launching the Alice games as well. Really is an honor to have you on today's show. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Nice to be here today.
Thank you. Before we talk about your kind of career in gaming, would you be okay to sort of start off about, maybe explaining your rather unusual name? I mean, it's a cool name, I have to say. I love it, but it's quite iconic. It's quite unusual. But how did you get your name, if you're happy with me to ask?
I wish I had one, concise answer for that, or one consistent answer for that. The problem is that everybody that I talk to about this in my family, they all give me different answers.
Right.
So some of them will say that it was my mom's idea because she knew a woman at university who had, I think, named her daughter America, which is a very common name in Central and South America, by the way, for girls. And then my mom said that, she thought that, American would be a good version of that for a boy. I also heard that my father saw it on a wall somewhere in the hospital. My mom told me she also was thinking of the name Obnard, Obnard, which means nothing. So, look, it was the 70s, I think, is the best way to describe what was going on, right? A lot of pot smoking, a lot of hippie free love, this kind of thing. That's probably the easiest way to describe it.
No, yeah, fair enough. Very cool. While you're growing up then, did you play a lot of video games? Did you have any consoles or computers in your house? And do you have any particular really good early memories of video games?
Well, I grew up pretty poor. So it wasn't until I think I was 13 years old that I got my first own kind of computer thing, which back in that era was a Timex Sinclair 2000, which was essentially like a calculator you could plug into your television, so you weren't really going to be playing a lot of games on that. But I think my earliest, introduction to video games was arcade machines. I'd walk home from school and there'd be Dig Dug and there'd be Moon Patrol and there'd be, Asteroids. And I mean, we're talking, Defender, like that era, right? So in terms of the kinds of games that, I eventually got into making, obviously there wasn't anything on a level of sort of graphics or storytelling to make me think like, oh, I want to go on to make games. But around, in my teens, I did finally get a Commodore 64, and I began poking around making my own, sort of little dungeon crawlers and things like that. But even at that age, I can remember playing games and thinking games were fun, but I just didn't have this notion that like I myself would go on to make games. I was very interested in storytelling and in writing, but it just hadn't crossed my mind that like that was a path that I could even pursue.
What sort of stories were you interested in back then? Were you reading a lot of classic novels and things, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was a voracious reader. In fact, because I never finished high school due to family instability, I guess would be the word.
Right.
I was out of the house at a very very young age, and I was forced to drop out of school as a result. But when I dropped out of high school, I remember getting in trouble as the last thing as I was leaving because they had opened up my locker and several lockers next to my locker where I had been stealing books from the library and putting them in the locker. And I had a bunch of them at home, and I think they figured that out. And they're like, could you bring back all the books that we think you stole? But at that time, I was a big fan of a range of things. If it was sort of classical horror like Mary Shelley or Edgar Allan Poe, but I was also really into science fiction. I remember in high school, I got really into like Arthur C. Clarke, and I sort of then transitioned into Heinlein. So sort of fantasy, sci-fi type of stuff. Very big fan of sort of just adventure in general, Robinson Crusoe type stuff. And I think that followed over eventually into the types of stories I like telling, adventure tales, but of course with a very psychological kind of surreal twist to them.
Oh, we'll talk about those later for sure. Again, I don't want to American, I don't want to get too like personal of your personal life and things, but I think you said in previous interviews that you did have a bit of you hinted earlier a bit of an unconventional childhood. Obviously, I don't want to bring up bad memories and whatnot, but do you think that did have an influence about how your career, where it took you, and even subconsciously about some of the stories and the games you develop and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that we as individuals, much less as creators or storytellers, each one of us is a creator. We are all storytellers in some fashion, that's sort of like the point of us being put on this planet is to bring order to chaos to some degree. And the way in which we organize things is itself a function of the environment in which we were raised and the way in which we found to organize the chaos in our lives, right? And so as an extension of that, like you'll hear it often said that, when you find a storyteller, that's successful at storytelling, oftentimes they're telling the same tale over and over again. And that tale at its core is something that is their story. It's deeply personal to them. And so I think that my childhood, it was tumultuous. It was unusual. It was creative in some fashion. It was also, there were a lot of destructive elements in it. But it was the exposure to those things and the learning how to overcome those things that gave me my voice as a creator. Like one of the things that I'm really big into is asking people not to shy away from those things about themselves, instead to kind of run towards them and embrace those things, as difficult as that may be, because in that process of accepting who you are, that's a transformative process. You get out of that the gold of being a creator, right? You get out of that the stuff that you have to, it's difficult to earn, but it's what makes you have an original or a genuine voice.
I mean, yeah, embrace it. What good advice, actually. Thank you. I'd love to know, actually, because you said earlier you never really thought as a child that you wanted to, even thought about getting into video games as a job, but and you said you didn't finish high school. Are you happy to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit about how that led to? How did you get the opportunity, and what were you doing before you got into video games?
Sure. This is before the interview started. I mentioned this story's been told a lot, so I apologize to the people who've heard this before, but I'm sure there's plenty of people out there who haven't. I dropped out of high school and I bounced around to a couple of different sort of nonsense dead-end jobs, but I eventually settled on car mechanic because I have car mechanics working in my family, and I had one uncle in particular who took me under his wing. And he sort of brought me into the shop where he was working. So I spent some years working in a shop that specialized with German cars, BMWs and Volkswagens and Mercedes, that kind of thing. And I think I got to be pretty good at it. I mean, I like tools. I have a crazy workshop here full of like every tool imaginable,
Nice.
Lathes and 3D printers and you name it. So I'm very hands-on, mechanical. So that it really kind of suited me in a lot of ways. But in the midst of that, I happened to move to a new apartment complex in Mesquite, Texas. And that is where I met John Carmack, because he also was living there. We became friends. He invited me up to id a couple of times to test this new game they were working on called Doom. And I was really blown away because at the car shop where I was working, I had convinced the owner there to buy I think it was a 386. And I was trying to basically digitize their inventory control, their inventory in general. I was trying to build this database for all the inventory in the shop. And so I had been playing Wolfenstein on this thing.
Yeah.
And little did I know that I'm living in the same compound as the guys that made this. I started going up to their office, and at some point John took me aside and said, look, it seems like you're kind of wasting your time working on cars. Would you like to come work in my office? And the original offer was to be there to answer phones. So I was wearing a headset, much like the one that you're wearing, and I was doing tech support. People would call and say, hey, your game blew up my house, or your game, destroyed my computer or whatever. And it would be my job, along with Sean Green, to talk them through their problem and get their game up and running. So that was how I ended up in the door at id.
I mean, that's a great story. Did you always get on with John Carmack? Was he a bit of a mentor for you, or was it he got you in, you didn't really see him again? Or I mean, that how would you reflect on that relationship?
Yeah, well, I felt that he also took me under his wing. He clearly saw something in me that he wanted to nurture. It may have been my life story that appealed to him somehow, that I was out on my own and struggling at such an early age. I think he also saw my passion for and knowledge about computers. And so he must have recognized something that he wanted to try to help out. But no one really knew, even I didn't know until I sat down with the game editor, that I had a propensity, a skill for doing level design. But in terms of my relationship with him, I mean, yeah, we became quite close. In fact, we ended up buying houses right next door to each other. So we were neighbors for some years. But I think it's well known that John is a particular, sort of personality type. He's, I think, for a lot of people in the company at that time, it's difficult to get very close to him because he really is a workaholic, and he's very much constantly in his head around the problems that he's trying to solve. But I think that I was, able to enjoy some kind of closeness to his thought process and him as an individual for some years there, especially when we were working on Quake. I worked really closely with him from the initial development of the engine and the editor and the scripting language. There was a very nice collaboration that took place between the two of us at that time. But things changed, and everybody kind of went their own separate ways. And these days, I've seen him at trade events and things like that. He's still perfectly friendly and happy to see each other. But I now live in China, which means there's a lot of distance between me and the people I used to know in those days.
I've spoken to Bill Raybock before. I don't know if he worked at Atari, and he was telling the story that I think John Carmack could get Doom on the Atari in a weekend. He managed to get it in the car, and it's a very good port. Apparently, well, it's a good port. But it just shows you the workaholic and the man he was, I guess. Amazing, really.
Yeah.
So id Software, obviously, Wolfenstein came out, massive game, but you were working on Doom. What was your initial role? Was it testing firstly that he sort of rose through the ranks? Is that right, American? Yeah. Yeah.
So by the time I had started working there, Doom was already released.
Oh, right. Okay.
I had tested on Doom, but I hadn't had any development role on it at all. Then on Doom 2, I actually ended up building maps that went into the game. And there were a couple of sort of level packs or map pack type releases. And I was involved with those. And then I worked on Quake and Quake 2 and some more, sort of level packs and some other related products and ports and stuff in between. But primarily, I mean, when I talk about people, what did I do? It's safe to say like early Doom and Quake stuff. That was kind of it.
Have you played like the most recent Doom games, for example? Are you a fan of FPS titles personally?
Yeah, I did play the most recent one for about an hour. And it's so I'm embarrassed to say this, but a lot of games these days become so frantic that I don't get a lot of enjoyment out of it anymore. It's funny, like I can really enjoy a game like Red Dead Redemption, the new one, or Days Gone, where it's got these moments of action, but you're doing a lot of exploring and you're kind of enjoying the environment, and there's a story and things like that. So when it comes to like a Doom type FPS thing, and it's the same if I try to go back and play a deathmatch now, I don't enjoy the feeling of the adrenaline rush that comes into my body from playing those types of games. And that's not to knock on people who want to play things like that. It's just that it doesn't appeal to me much anymore. But I did play that most recent Doom, and it's interesting to see the technical art and the the literal, art of it, the sounds and the graphics and everything, it's amazing. I mean, it's just amazing where the technology has gone, especially when you go back and you look. If you go back and play Doom right now, and it's at 320 by 200, it's impossible to understand that at some point in our history, we would look at that and say that was high resolution and it was incredible graphics and it was amazing and it was immersive. Because now it just looks like a mess of pixels. It's hard to even understand what it is you're looking at sometimes. But back in the day when you looked at that, you were there. You felt it. You were like hairs on the back of your neck, and it was crazy. So it's I think also really interesting to me just to kind of see how our brains were so active in filling in the gaps, whereas these days I think you don't have to work as hard to fill the gaps in because it's all done for you.
Interesting. I mean, do you reflect very positively, or I suppose differently, working for id and working on Doom and Quake? I mean, it's huge titles. Let's be completely honest, absolutely incredible titles. How do you feel about looking back at that time? Do you think it did shape your career quite a lot?
Well, for sure. But, at the same time, like, if you had asked me this question, 1 year after I left id, 5 years, 10 years, as time goes by, I mean, what are we talking? 20, 30 years.
It's crazy, isn't it?
We're coming up on, I was 20 years old. I will be 50 this year. So we're talking 30 years ago that I was working on those. So, it's kind of funny. I don't even know that I really retain proper memories of the stuff. I think I just retain the sort of voice pattern for recalling the event, because it all seems like such a distant memory now. It's hard to remember anything but these very particular highlights. But for sure, it had an absolutely huge bearing on my career back in those days. But since then, I've managed to reinvent myself multiple times over. So it's like, that was cool, but I mean, that was a really long time ago.
No, thank you, Aaron. Last question really before we move on to you work in electronic arts and so forth is, again, I know you've answered this question before, and I feel a bit bad asking because no one wants to talk about getting fired, but you did mention, I think in a previous interview, that it was an important event for you. Whether it was a fun event, it's a different question, but are you happy just to explain, reiterate, and maybe go in a little bit of depth why it was important for you being fired by id and what happened maybe?
Well, first of all, I find this topic fascinating simply because depending on who you ask about this, you will get different answers. And I've always tried to remain relatively neutral, simply for the fact that the easiest way for me to explain what happened is to say I don't know, because it really came out of the blue for me. I'm sitting there working on maps one day. I get called into the art room for a meeting. All of the owners of id, Adrian and Kevin and John, are there. And they go, we want to talk to you about something. We're going to let you go. And, it was it was a shock, because it was like, what are you talking about? We just finished Quake 2. And on Quake 2, if you go and look at the, sort of the credits list for that, you'll see that I produced a tremendous amount of content for that game. Not any more or less than anyone else who worked on it. Right. And also in terms of quality, if you ask people about the maps that I produced in there, those are some of the maps that people consider their favorites in that game. So, clearly something happened that was over my head. But it wasn't until years later that I had other people who were working there at the time come out and say, this guy torpedoed you and, you were done wrong. I don't know about that stuff. But here's the thing. If I was the victim of political subterfuge and there was someone there who managed to get me fired unfairly, I would like to say to that person, thank you, because the resulting journey, and it's funny because I experienced this even before I understood that I might have been booby trapped or whatever the word would be. I understood this when I was fired and a week later, because the initial reaction to being fired was shock and depression and sadness and just a general kind of what the fuck, right? But about a week later, I found myself experiencing this crazy sense of relief because I was no longer in a situation where I was expected to go and work for 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. And remember, that was the default.
Yeah,
and I had been doing that there for years without really questioning it. And there was a kind of psychological pressure going on that I think was very unhealthy for the people that were involved in it. And not just psychological pressure, physical pressure as well, right? I mean, fortunately, we were young. If I tried to do that these days, I'd just keel over and die. So anyway, I eventually found myself feeling great relief. And then because of being fired, that ended up in my transitioning to a whole different world. I ended up leaving Texas and moving to California, which I loved. I went and worked at EA, which I loved. And I got to make a game and put my name on it, which was incredible.
That's pretty cool.
I was like, well, again, if there was somebody behind my being fired and their goal they thought was to make my life poorer as a result, they failed. And again, I'd like to say thanks because that was a huge favor was done for me. Yeah.
And again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you mentioned that you got like resilience from your childhood. Maybe that helped as well a little bit and brought you back off the canvas. And look what happened.
I hadn't learned that stuff at that age. I was only 24 years old.
Oh,
right?
Fair enough. Yeah.
And think about it. Like if you're going to be in a rock star game development company and you're going to be fired from it, I mean, best to do it early on, right? And then you still have many years to go to bounce back and reinvent yourself and stuff like that. So again, I mean, I can't look back on any of that stuff with any sort of upset or anger or whatever. And again, the timing was perfect. I mean, it ended up putting me on another path that ended up towards lots of great stuff happening. And then that path ended and put me on a different path. There's this Chinese proverb about a guy who, he's riding his horse, he falls off and breaks his leg and he thinks that that's a bad thing. But the next day the army comes through and is collecting all of the men of fighting age to take them off and sacrifice them in battle. And so the little story goes on and on. Like every time there's a bad twist in his life, he initially thinks of it as something that's not good. But the next twist, it's like, oh, it's a good thing I broke my leg that day or I'd be in the army tomorrow, So I tend to look at life like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't suppose you ever thought where your life would be right now if you weren't fired. Who knows? We'll never know, will we, American? But
who knows? Yeah. Who knows? But I think it is potentially telling. Look at the different paths that everybody took from that first generation of id.
Yeah.
Where are they today? There may be some lessons in that.
Oh, good on you. Let's talk about Electronic Arts. Let's talk about the Alice games because absolutely incredible. Electronic Arts, huge company again. Let's be honest. But how did that opportunity arrive? You weren't unemployed for long. I take it you got a good opportunity. And what were your early days at the company like? Was it always Alice, or was there other stuff you did before then?
Well, it was really weird because the initial path into EA was through Michael Crichton and the creator of Jurassic Park.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So I got this very strange email or phone call where it was like, would you like to come out to North Carolina? We want you to take a look at this project to know if you want to be a designer on it. And we can't tell you what it is and we can't tell you anything, but we'll send a plane and you can come out. So I get there, they put me in this tech park. I end up in this tech park in North Carolina. By the way, that's where like Epic is. There's a lot of game development studios or game engine studios there at that time. And so they put me in this white room with it felt weird. It was like a scene out of the Matrix or something. And they're like, what do you want to drink? And I said, I have a Coke or something. Well, the guy who comes and brings the Coke in is Michael Crichton. And the most bizarre thing about this was that my fiance at the time had been reading this book called Travels, which is his autobiography. And she had given it to me, and I just started reading it, and I was really engrossed. And I'm like, this Michael Crichton guy is really cool because, he's super smart. He went to university, did his doctoral degree in medicine at the same time that he was writing all these novels that were blowing up, Andromeda Strain and stuff like that. And so, and then he ejects out of the medical business straight into Hollywood and, invented ER and did all this stuff. Yeah. So I'm reading this book and I'm like, this guy's fucking awesome, And so who walks in the door with the Coke? It's him. And I'm looking at the back of the book and I'm like, what's going on here? Like, is this a joke? So they invited me to work on this game called Timeline, which is now, you can go and watch this movie called Timeline. You can read the book called Timeline. So I was involved with the genesis of that project in general. Like I would spend time with Crichton talking back and forth on, what is the story? How does the story work? How do we turn this into a game? Stuff like that. So in the middle of all that, then these guys show up and it turns out they're from EA. And at some point they said, hey, how would you like to be on our team? Because we're going to be the ones to fund this project and see it turn into a game. And we like your style and we like the way you're interacting with this team, but we want you on our side. And so I went to EA. Then I promptly told them that this project was terrible and they should kill it.
Oh, no.
Because it was the developer that was building it did not know what they were doing. And fortunately, because I made a very difficult call, and it meant also sacrificing what I had in terms of a relationship with Crichton, with this team.
Of course.
So it was an personally expensive decision to make. But I did that. IDOS picked that title up, and then they published it, and I think it sold like one copy. So it validated the decision I made. But that was how I ended up at EA. And initially, they continued to keep me in this role, which was terrible, of going out and doing essentially like due diligence or a sort of like development review process on struggling developers. And I was really good at it. But the problem was I would arrive at these development studios and people would start crying. They'd start running for the doors. Because I basically was turned into the Grim Reaper. And, primarily because I told it like it was. Like if I showed up and things were busted, I would say this is busted. But a lot of times that meant that their budget was gone and that they died. So that was my my first year at EA, and that was how I transitioned to EA as well.
That's mad. You sound like the Doom guy, just destroying all the potential games.
Dude, there was one time that I went to a studio in Texas, and they had split themselves inside their building. The programmer had barred himself behind furniture in his office at one end of a hallway in the building. And the whole rest of the team was in this other room all the way at the other end of the building. I mean, Pete, you think you're going to like look at a game, and sometimes you're literally talking some dude out of a tree who's lost it mentally,
Yeah.
But this goes back to what I was talking about with like, the development culture, at id, where you're working 18 hours a day. A lot of developers were doing that and are still doing that. And so the pressure is incredibly intense. And so many times when you go to talk to these teams about the failings that were happening within their developments, it comes always back to people, and it always comes back to the interaction between personalities. And especially because with game development, you're almost always dealing with the analytical, technical programmer side and the emotional feeling art side. And it's sort of the, my camera thinks I'm talking to it, but I'm not.
Yeah, zoomed in.
So yeah, I mean that oil and water combination of tech and art. When you go to see these projects that are failing, 9 times out of 10, it's that personnel issue, that drives those failures.
Was there any particular games that you helped, in your opinion, launch and turn around American, or was it mainly bad news really in that sense?
I was bad news wherever And, but at that time, I was at they had me stationed at Maxis while they were working on The Sims. And so I became really close with Will Wright. And I think a lot of people don't know this, but EA in that time tried multiple times to kill The Sims, which then went on to be their most successful, profitable IP ever, right? But while I was there at Maxis, I watched this, and I was in on a couple of these sort of do or die meetings for The Sims. I won't say I had anything to do with, I had absolutely nothing to do with the project surviving. That was on Will and Lucy Bradshaw, who was the lead on those things. But to watch this same sort of dynamic taking place, except internally at EA, it's not a fun thing. It's not a fun thing at all.
No, it doesn't sound it. We can laugh about it, but it's not really funny, is it? When you think about it, it isn't. I've got to ask about Alice. Then I've got to ask how that evolved. Were you always a fan of the famous Lewis Carroll story, and was it always in the back of your mind to make this game, or what inspired you to? And how did that opportunity come to get Alice into fruition? Then, so
I had read the Alice books when I was a kid, for sure. I remember having them, and I remember reading them, and I remember being an okay fan of them. I mean, not like over the top, but I thought they were interesting. When the time came to do my own game, this came about because I had said to the guys at EA, look, I don't want to be the Grim Reaper anymore. I don't like being the guy who goes out and kills studios. I think they were just trying to sort of search around and figure out what to do with me. And one of the president's, studio head guys named Rich Hilleman came and said, well, why don't you propose to make your own game? So come up with an idea, make your own proposal, and we'll see if we can make it go. And he hooked me up with artist Terry. Now I've got Rich's last name mixed up with Terry's. Sorry, Terry, you know who you are. But he hooked me up with Terry. Terry hooked me up with Norm, a bunch of artists that surrounded us. Terry Smith. So Rich hooked me up with Terry Smith, and Terry Smith hooked me up with Norm, who ended up working on the Alice game. And together we were kind of ideating, I guess you'd say. I was trying to figure out what would be a great way to show off artistically what these engines could do, because I'd come out of Doom and Quake and I felt like everybody does Space Marines, everybody does guns and violence, but there's so much more that I think these engines could do. And then there was a Heavy Metal Fact 2, was a game that was developed by Ritual in Dallas. And when you saw that game, because it was also built inside of the Quake engine, when you saw that, you were like, wow, these guys are really pushing art into this space in an amazing way. So I started thinking about what's a really artistic, surreal, and it came to me, Alice, but I at the same time had been talking to some friends in music and art, and a bunch of people had brought it up. They were like, man, you should think about Alice as a video game. So it felt like it was the zeitgeist. It felt like a lot of energy around the notion, but the I guess American McGee-ifying it, as people would say now, the making her into a little goth chick, that was just kind of, the space that I was living in. For a long time, my hair was dyed black, and, tattoos. And, I was really into wearing all black goth club clothes and stuff. So I think I felt that there was always something dark lurking in those stories, and a lot of people recognized it. They recognized it as a sort of counterculture, drug, psychedelic, psychologic type of story, and that no one had really pulled those themes out of there correctly. So we spent some months doing concept sketches and working on story stuff until we felt we'd nailed it. And when I say working on it, I mean we had stacks of art with various different ways of rendering a new Alice character. Some of them were bubblegum anime pop, and some of them were Wild West, and some of them we kept coming back to this. Now she's got to be this kind of dark goth something, until one day one of the artists just did this really quick rough sketch and was like, how about that? And I said, that's it.
Nice.
We found it, we nailed it. So it was an interesting process.
And it's set, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong. After Through the Looking Glass, after the second book, so it's kind of the third story, you could argue. But I mean, were you ever tempted to sort of almost retell the first book in your iconic tale, or are you always going to do a brand new story, American?
Well, I always wanted to branch her off, to have a fork in the path, so that we had a more blank canvas to work with. And there's also issues of just making sure that it's something that intellectual property wise you own, right? So it's important when you're doing that to deviate from what everybody expects to some degree. But yeah, I mean, I had a story in there that I wanted to tell related to a very personal and a psychological journey for this character through trauma, and using the tools of her mental landscape to overcome that trauma, because I felt like that was, again, something that in terms of like what games had done to that point in storytelling, no one had really ever done a psychological horror game in that fashion. And so I felt like there's a space there that we can, and it was weird because I just felt like, oh, this is what I'm here for. I have the tools to do this, and for it to be unique. That was what was really important. Yeah. Like I know this voice, and I can make this unique, and it'll play off of the things that I know how to do. Right. So that was how we ended up there.
You said it's definitely an original game, but was there any inspiration for it? Other video games or media? Obviously, I know the Alice stories, but was there anything else that kind of crept in, or was it,
Well, look, I remember I put together a folder of inspirational stuff. I mean, there was a Rob Zombie song at that time called Living Dead Girl that we would play during these presentations. At that time I was fairly close friends with Marilyn Manson, and I would go over and hang out with him, and we would talk alchemy, and we would talk about psychology. And he actually did a collection of tracks for the original game that never saw the light of day because we never got the licensing figured out. And they were incredible. It was like psychedelic Beatles era meets Marilyn Manson in Wonderland. And they were amazing. So there was a lot of inspiration like that floating around at the time, musical inspiration, artistic inspiration, like I said. And yeah, I mean, I felt like there was this weird thing happening where I would sit down with people and it just resonated. So, and this was among this group of friends in the film world and the music world and, the game space and writers. So there was a lot of inspiration coming from all over the place.
And those tracks by Marilyn Manson, they've never been released, and they're under lock and key. That's a shame, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, that's lawyers and managers, though. It happens all the time.